You cannot write this. The man from Slough, Matty Cash, to take a decisive penalty against England. Well, Cristiano, I do not remember this episode of The Office.
Good pen. Always good to go down the middle under pressure.
And so now, all the pressure is on the captain, Declan Rice. Need I remind you that if Rice misses, England are out. Rice to step up.
Oh no.
Woe upon woe for the Empire! Wales out! Scotland out! England, who just this last month fell to have a worse economy than Poland, are now eliminated by Poland in just the round of 16. And here in Riyadh, a former British protectorate of all places, the sun has truly set on the Empire.
Britain needs to wake up. Seriously, the least realistic part of that scenario was Ronaldo being on comms. Now, before I further upset any Brits by being an Aussie sanctimoniously lecturing them on what to do with their country, well, how to vote, allow me to establish my UK credentials. I was born in St Albans to a Geordie dad. I was literally going for Ben Stokes in both 2019 and 2023, and my birthday present from my grandparents were UK government bonds. I have a very vested £132 interest in the UK economy being strong. Oh, and I'll give you one more. The UK office is the true office. But the way Britain's headed, according to the World Bank, they're on path to be economically overtaken by Poland in 2030 and then Romania and Hungary by 2040.
So I was right all along. Hey, Mr. M.
No, we keep the culture wars out of these videos, but to understand why Britain is on this trajectory and therefore to understand how we fix it, we've got to begin the story over half a century ago with decolonisation. So at the end of World War II, the two clear decisive players in the game were the Soviets and America. Even though the UK civilian death toll was far higher than in the First World War, their broader impact on the war wasn't as crucial and they were therefore relegated behind the two new industrial superpowers. With this loss of influence came decolonisation in the 50s and the 60s, but because colonisation had allowed Britain to take control of much of Asia and Africa's resources, the people who were hurt most by the process were rich British elites with colonial business interests. Much of this group belongs to the City of London, which is different to the city, London. You see, right here on the map is a city within a city. It has its own Lord Mayor, as of 2021 had a population of around 8,000, and has none of the best bits of London like Wimbledon, Lords, the O2, the Den. Didn't think they'd get a mention, right? But crucially, what the City of London does have are the most powerful financial and business interests in Britain. And in the early days of decolonisation, Britain's Prime Minister Clement Attlee said this about the city. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control the money can pursue a policy at home and abroad, contrary to that which has been decided by the people. It's a damning quote, but we've got to ask ourselves, how did British finance wield so much power? Well, with the physical British Empire crumbling, UK bankers scrambled to open branches in the Caribbean outskirts. Places like the British Virgin Islands, the famous Cayman Islands over here, and even Bermuda were used as offshore jurisdictions. And these offshore bank accounts were enticing for two reasons. One, the government offered extremely low taxes, and two, they had extremely lax rules around banking trusts. Just so that we're all on the same page, these are funds or simply assets that are managed by someone for the benefit of someone else. At a really basic level, your dad might make you the trustee of your sister's Club Penguin account, and you do things like kart surfing and pizza making to keep it in good stead until your sister turns 10 and is able to access it. And in these offshore jurisdictions, the trustees don't need to meet any requirements, and there's no registry of trusts. With these very loose rules, heaps of people across the world were parking their assets and money in these countries to avoid paying tax. Sadly, one of the biggest users of these tax havens is Africa, which deprives the governments of much needed tax revenue, and it's estimated that $1 trillion from developing nations is going into these havens each and every year. I should also add that these tax havens were the perfect spot to dump proceeds of crime money. With the British banks being amongst the first to rush in and open these offshore branches, heaps of capital was made available to British bankers, and they started to become their own class within the country. By the 1980s, Thatcher's Big Bang allowed foreign banks into the UK, and so London became the world's financial hub. All of this saw a huge inflow of capital, which made the British pound really valuable. So far, so good for my £132 in British bonds, right? Well, not really. A high-value currency means less exports as businesses want to source cheaper imports. Effectively, this helped kill British manufacturing and made their economy even more dependent upon its banking industry. Just to give us some perspective, Britain currently has between 330 and 415,000 accountants worldwide, compared to France's 170,000. Yet they have almost identical population sizes. Britain's GDP per capita is only marginally ahead of France's, and they have about 300,000 less people working in manufacturing. Need I remind you that France isn't exactly a manufacturing powerhouse, as Germany has nearly double the number of manufacturing workers. So if I haven't made it clear, Britain is extremely dependent upon their banking industry, and so these guys are really powerful. For instance, David Cameron's dad was involved in offshore trusts in the 80s, and that helped fund him through the illustrious Eton College, essentially a rite of passage for many future Tory MPs, including Boris. Now, having a huge banking sector is not inherently an issue at all. After all, it's a great source of credit to many businesses who can stimulate and grow the economy. However, from Thatcher onwards, the banking sector became very heavily geared towards real estate speculation. Essentially, Thatcher introduced the 1980 Housing Act, which encouraged social housing tenants to buy their homes at a discount, but they still needed a mortgage to go ahead and do so. She also introduced another Housing Act in 1988, which allowed landlords to repossess their home after just 6 months and abolished rent regulations. This made being a landlord much more appealing and incentivized people to put their wealth into real estate, which then involved them coming to the bank for more mortgages. In 2016, wages had only risen 4.8% since Thatcher was in office, but housing prices had risen by 1,200%. In the same year, the Bank of England, their version of the Federal Reserve, did a survey and found that 30% of viable businesses were unable to access the necessary finance to grow their business. Have a look at these pie graphs here. In the blue are commercial banks. These are the ones that primarily give mortgages and invest in assets rather than businesses. Britain's share is 82% compared to France's 45% and Germany's 36%. As someone who lives in Sydney, i.e. one of the worst manufactured property bubbles in the world, let me tell you that this is dreadful for the economy as money goes into something that just stands still and doesn't produce anything, rather than something that generates actual value like new businesses. And if all that was too heavy with the graphs and the charts, here's Boris saying invertebrate jellies to bring you back.
What is it? Supine protoplasmic invertebrate jellies.
So with the UK banking sector so huge, it played a pretty huge role in the GFC, as American mortgages were traded between banks, which then incentivized banks to sign people up for ridiculous mortgages that they could never afford because they weren't the ones that had to deal with the fallout. The often heard saying was that UK banks turned the subprime mortgage crisis into a global financial crisis. So apart from being culpable for the GFC, the UK banks were heavily impacted by the GFC. One in particular was Northern Rock, Newcastle United's sponsor on FIFA 08. They actually suffered a bank run, essentially where everyone withdraws their money at once for fear of the bank failing, which in turn causes the bank to fail, and they were at risk of closing entirely. They reached out to the Bank of England for help and were eventually taken over by Gordon Brown's Labour government. Let me know in the comments, can bank bailouts ever be a good idea? Brown then went on to deliver £137 billion in bank bailouts to protect the industry, and still, Northern Rock ended up going defunct. In 2010, Brown's government was defeated by David Cameron's Tories, who governed in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. And this is where the collision of bad policy and a protected banking sector really caused Britain to plummet. So, this guy right here, George Osborne, well, he was Cameron's Chancellor of the Exchequer, what we would call the Treasurer, and he announced that Britain was about to face huge austerity measures. Now, that word austere means harsh. Economically, it means a huge cut in government spending to public services. The bank bailouts had put Britain in a £163 billion deficit, and according to Osborne, the slashes to government spending were going to cover that deficit. Now, on the surface, this makes a lot of sense. After all, on an individual level, when your personal finances are hard, cutting spending is a good idea. The issue is that this economic school of thought is more outdated than the 80s food pyramid. One of the key lessons that we learned during the Great Depression is that cutting spending during hardship is terrible, and that instead it should be cut during times of prosperity. America, the land who prides itself on a small government, literally voted like this in 1928 and then like this in 1932 when they thought Hoover wasn't doing enough public spending. When you manage your personal finances, you're only worrying about one bank account. When you're managing the UK economy, you're worried about tens of millions. Cutting spending to, say, the NHS puts a wardsman out of work who therefore cannot buy bread, which puts the bakery out of business. And so Osborne ordered all government departments to slash an average of 25% from their budgets yearly and announced a 2-year public sector wage freeze. Now, austerity measures tend to be extremely harsh on the commoner, but not so for the elite. It's your battler from Blackpool who relies on the NHS, not the banker from Chelsea. And really, the whole sequence of events was a middle finger to UK taxpayers. First, the British banks acted negligently, which led to many Brits losing their jobs. Then their taxpayer dollars went into keeping the banks afloat. Then their services that their tax went towards got slashed to make up the dividend for the bank bailouts. From 2010 until 2019, real wage growth slowed by an average of half. In 2009, 46.1% of GDP went to the public sector and fell to 39% in 2018. Now, if you're an observant listener, you might be sitting here thinking, well, cutting spending is one way to fill the deficit, but couldn't the government generate more revenue too through things like tax? Well, absolutely, Britain could have. But as the 2010s rolled on, they didn't. In 2010, when the Tories came in, the corporate tax rate was 28%. By 2017, it had been repeatedly cut to 19%. That's £7 billion a year in revenue that was lost that could have gone into government services or anything other than banking profit margins. On top of that, the top income bracket was cut and inheritance tax was also cut. Cameron said that this was their reward for enduring the early years of austerity, but when he resigned over Brexit, Theresa May also continued the cuts to tax authorities. So the HM Revenue and Customs is essentially Britain's tax collection department, and during austerity, funding cuts caused them to close down local branches, lay off 15,600 tax collectors, and the National Audit Office reported that 4 million calls to the HMRC went unanswered. The net result was that £35 billion went uncollected, and approximately a third of Britain's billionaires kept their money in offshore bank accounts, meaning more tax revenue was lost on top of that. Homelessness has doubled since the Tories came to power, and on top of that, migration has ballooned. Now, as a migrant myself, I'm of course not anti-migration, and the whole Brexit migration thing was a huge misnomer. High migration from non-EU countries ballooned after Brexit, and was actually good for the Tories because it helped their donors' profits. The more people competing for a meal deal at Tesco, the higher the price can be. The final piece of austerity that has really impacted Britain has been the huge cuts to universities. Now, I have an arts and education degree, and there were so many subjects that I couldn't believe the taxpayer was supporting me in studying. But government funding to arts degrees is a necessary evil in allowing universities to do what really matters, research and development. South Korea, a country with basically no natural resources and certainly no colonial advantages like a big banking sector, exported $116 billion in 2021 in integrated circuits. The UK's top export in 2021 was cars at $30 billion. So there's a huge banking sector who cares more about housing bubbles than investing in viable growth opportunities for businesses, and a government who barely taxes them and won't invest in government services, leaving huge gaps in training or in R&D. And for that reason, if the growth trend continues as it did in the 2010s at 0.5%, Poland will overtake Britain in just 7 years. The Battle of Britain was over 80 years ago. That's a very big way of repaying the Poles. But I don't want this video to be all doom and gloom. If you're a Brit, there are answers. 1. Vote Labour in the next election. I have plenty of issues with Keir Starmer, and I do get it, Lily Allen's antics do come across as very annoying, and it just about makes me want to vote Tory simply out of spite. But quite simply, Partygate and Brexit aside, the Tories have gutted funding of their supporters to prop up their donors. 2. Join your union. Not necessarily to go on strike, that's not where the power lies. Greg Hands, a Tory chairperson, said this about Labour earlier on in the year. Who pulls the strings behind the Labour Party? The trades unions. And that's not him unveiling some secret. I don't disagree with him at all. Labour is certainly beholden to the unions and the Tories are beholden to big business. One works in the interest of workers, which is in the interest of the broader nation, while the other works in the interest of corporations' profit margins. That being said, union membership is on the decline in Britain, dropping from 13 million in 1979 to 6.4 million in 2019, though there was a little spike at the end of the 2010s. If people aren't in their unions, then simply they don't have power and can't influence politics, meaning that big business will fill the gap in order to hedge their bets. If you don't believe me, look at what happened to the Democrats in America. JP Morgan gave $4.7 million in donations in the 2020 election, of which 67% went to the Democrats and 33% went to the Republicans. Remember, the Democrats were largely union-based until Reagan busted them in the 80s. Quite simply, there's 7 years to fix this. If Sunak is to push the election as late as possible to January 2025, there may only be one more election before 2030. You endured the pain of Hurricanes missed last year. Don't let that Declan Rice scenario play out in 2030. We cannot afford to sleepwalk into the 2030s. In the same way that the offshore banks of the 60s helped shape modern Britain, find out how the rise of China in the 80s may shape your future. Click here.